Hi everyone. This is was supposed to be lecture 9 for California labor. This is actually about immigrant work. And I think really what I wanted to do was provide a macro level overview of immigration so we understand actually who's working in California in the contemporary context. You've just finished all your reading for all of the agriculture piece, in particular the United Farm Workers. And I think this is sort of the final piece that I want to put together. The reason I didn't front load this particular lecture by putting it at the beginning of the agriculture section is that I think that it's the numbers that you're going to see here and the demographics that you're looking at are particularly pertinent for all types of immigrant work, not just agriculture. So keep that in mind, that on the one hand, this lecture informs the agriculture section, but it also informs the upcoming piece that you're going to do after your midterm. This is a map that's generated by the New York Times as part of their Immigration Explorer. You could just plug it into type in New York Times and Immigration Explorer, and what you'll see is that it's a map of foreign-born groups and how they've settled across the United States. As you'll see on the right-hand side, you'll see the key that tells you the colors associated with different immigrant groups. The darker the color, the more population density you have. In other words, population density equals larger numbers of people in a concentrated area. So let's look first in what's most pertinent to us here in this particular class, which is California. And you'll see that the dark red color that really is very solidly blocked out there here in Southern California is indicates foreign-born from Latin America. In other words, immigrants from Latin America who have migrated to the United States. And you'll see that, not surprisingly, in California, and Southern California especially, and all throughout the Southwest, which includes New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas, the Southwest region of the United States is very heavily populated with people who were born in Latin America, and Latin America includes quite a huge amount of space, including Mexico, Central America, including Nicaragua, Panama, Costa Rica, as well as Latin America also refers to South America as well. So keep in mind that you really have two and a half continents kind of represented there. If you look up towards San Francisco, you'll see it's shaded in orange. You'll see that orange color there. And that's where we begin to see kind of a greater population density of Asian immigrants or foreign-born Asians who are living in California. Again, not necessarily surprising that given that there was already a pre-existing Asian American population there, that people would migrate there. And I think that if we actually zoomed in on the county level, which you actually can do on this map when you go online, is that you'll see that there are pockets even here in Los Angeles where you have a greater population density of Asians and other Eastern European immigrants. You'll also see that in the most northern part of California, you have an influx of Western European groups. Now, I mean, when you look at this map, kind of stepping back outside of California, not surprising. You look at the northern border, where the population density of immigrants or foreign-born Canadians, are very highly concentrated in along the northern border of the United States, including, you can look at Maine, North Dakota, Montana, Minnesota. Again, not necessarily surprising. I think what we can begin to see, particularly let's stay with the immigrants foreign-born from Latin America. You'll see that they are spattered throughout all of the United States in places like Nebraska, Iowa, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina. And I point that out specifically because these are all what we call right-to-work states, where they do not necessarily have to, and I'll go into this in a much later lecture, where these states basically argue that that companies don't necessarily have to follow union laws or acknowledge unions, and that policy is called right to work, and I'll get to that in a later section. But you'll see that in places like North Carolina and Tennessee, that's where places like Tyson Chicken or Foster Farms are located. where they have a high number of immigrant workers who are working there. You've seen some manufacturing move into areas like Nebraska as well, or Iowa. So, and then of course you have your traditional immigrant receiving areas like California, but you also see similar density numbers for Latinos in New York and Florida as well. And the one thing I'll point out that we can't disaggregate based on this map is that they're using racialized categories, very large categories that encompass, 20, 30, or in some cases 35 different ethnic groups. So you can't really understand from this map that, for example, Latinos in Florida might be very different than Latino populations in California. So, for example, in Florida, we know that there's a high density of Cubans, as well as those from the islands like Puerto Rico. Same thing with New York. You have Dominicanos, you have Puerto Ricans, you have numerous other populations there that are different groups from Latin America. Whereas in the United States, you have a huge, in California, you have a huge population of those from Mexico, and to some extent Central Americans as well. So this is a phrase that should be relatively familiar to all of you. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beyond the golden door. Why don't you take a minute to think about this and ask yourself, where have I seen this particular quote? Well, for those of you guys who keep up with all the different inscriptions and with your American history, you know that this is the inscription on the Statue of Liberty. That this inscription was supposed to be symbolic of the United States being a place of the new world, of new opportunity. That it was a space and place where individuals who were oppressed in their country of origin could come. And I think the question I want you to think about is whether this still remains true. Does our current immigration policy really still stick to this particular sentiment? So why study immigration and immigrants? Well, there's numerous reasons why you study immigration and immigrants, and if you haven't already figured out 4 weeks into a class, it's also a central part of how I've organized a class on California labor. But what we do know is that immigration is central to U.S. history and the development of the nation state. In other words, when we first look at the development of unions in the United States, it really started here in California. And it started out in California, in terms of Samuel Gompers and all of the sort of initial pioneers of unions. It started here in the United States as an anti-immigration movement. That labor unions started as an anti-immigration movement. It was a way in which to try to preserve wages, to combat the recruitment of foreign-born workers, and the sort of labor competition that came along with that in here, particularly in California. And in California was very instrumental in passing the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which was the first national immigration policy, and it was also the first immigration policy that explicitly named a group that it would exclude. So that is just one way in which we begin to think about why immigration is central to the development of U.S. history. Not to mention that unless you are indigenous to these lands and you're Native American, you come from an immigrant background. And this is a history that is often forgotten, that unless you are Native American, you are an immigrant to these lands. Granted, it might be 5, 6, 7 generations, but you are from an immigrant background. Immigration and immigrants also helps us interpret and understand inequality, both past and present. Not only are the stories of immigrants central to understanding wage disparity, wage competition, labor competition, but we also begin to understand, as you saw in some of the narratives around the UFW, around the Okies, that we begin to understand that the different classes and status that we attach to a group lead to the allocation of resources or the lack of allocation of resources to particular groups. It also helps us understand the political economic conditions that spur migration, but also what develops in the U.S. and abroad. Here, what I'm trying to say is that we need to understand immigration not just as what's happening in the United States, but that it's connected to our foreign policy abroad. It's attached to the history of war. It's attached to U.S. colonialism and the colonialism of Western Europe and other countries. It is attached to so many other global dynamics like globalization, global production, the advancement of technology. All of these things are instrumental to why people choose to stay in a country or choose to leave for better opportunities. It also helps us understand the unique identity politics central to U.S. politics. In other words, when we think about U.S. politics, it's not just about Democrats and Republicans, but it's also about how race matters, about how you're born matters. It's about how we think about race and citizenship. So, for example, we know, particularly during Barack Obama's first term as U.S. president, as the first African American president, there was a whole group called the Birthers that essentially argued that that Barack Obama was not a citizen of the United States. That claim, despite the public release of his birth certificate, etc., right? That claim was about race and identity politics and who's considered American and who's not, and how racialized that politics is. So why we study immigration is to begin to understand how people interpret differences. Now, we've already gone through this, but I think we already went through this a couple lectures ago. A number of you have included this on your write-ups, but human migration is simply pure and simple about the movement of humans from one locality to another. As we saw with the Okies, it was from moving from Oklahoma to California or to Arizona and California. It is also about leaving your country of origin and coming to the United States. So for people like my parents, it was leaving China and coming to San Francisco and to California specifically. And again, as we've noted previously, you have voluntary migration, which is within or outside of one's region or country, where one makes a choice. And then you also have involuntary migration, which includes things like the slave trade, human trafficking, and ethnic cleansing. International migration, which is really what the core focus that we're looking at here this week, and both in terms of the United Farm Workers, but also why I assigned George Sanchez's Race and Nation paper, is that international migration is about moving from one nation state to another for work, education, to escape persecution, and for purposes of family reunification. Now, I'm going to go through a series of demographics here because I think in order to understand what's going on in terms of immigration, I think it's also important to understand the different statistics, like the hard numbers. And here I've chosen to use all statistics from government sources, namely the census or another branch of the census, which is called the American Community Survey. I think it's particularly important with immigration and actually labor statistics as well, that we not use anecdotal evidence, but we actually use what we call larger survey information that is publicly verifiable, because they're much more reliable, and we also understand that we can actually track where the information came from. One of the biggest things that happens in particularly highly politicized debates is numbers get thrown out, but we can't track where those numbers came from. So know that I always use numbers that are maybe run by different think tanks, but they all come from sources that we can track. So here, this is the statistical portrait of the foreign-born population in the United States as of 2009. It's important to note that oftentimes there's about a 3-year lag time on data, on statistical data from the census, just because of how long it takes to collect census information, right? But what we begin to see here is it shows 2009 in the far left column. You see the 2009 population. On the right, and then in the column to its right, the 2000 population, and you can see the different percentages. In terms of native born, those born here in the United States, about 87.5% of the population was born. 87.5% were born here in the United States. 12.5% were foreign born. We can then see their citizenship and non-citizen status, right? In terms of foreign born by region of birth, as of 2009, In other words, who's foreign-born in the United States? Again, not surprisingly, of those who are foreign-born, 30% are from Mexico, 24% from South and East Asia, 23% from the Caribbean, Central and South America, and 23% from Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, and quote-unquote other, which is pretty big lumping there. But in other words, it's all other countries not including those three. So what we do understand is Mexico clearly is a big feeding nation in terms of feeding the U.S. Economy with workers, sending people. It's a big sending country. This is, again, a statistical portrait of the foreign-born population in the United States as of 2009. Here I highlight the number I really want you to look at, where you can begin to see the exponential growth. Essentially, when you look at the last 20 years, this is sort of a 20-year pocket of time from 1990 to 2010, you've seen the exponential growth of populations from Mexico, as well as South and East Asia. And I'll talk a little bit about why in terms of policy. But what we begin to see here, right, is that it helps us understand the changing demographics of the United States. This is just another way in which we look at this from the Census Population Survey of 2006. The top 20 sending countries. Again, some of this shouldn't surprise folks given what we've seen, but this gives actually a much more specific breakdown. Number 1 is Mexico. Number 2 is China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. And I'll just point out as that that's sort of a problematic grouping there, in that China and Taiwan politically do not get along, and Hong Kong just being returned to China from England as a colony. Number 3 is the Philippines. 4 is India, 5 is El Salvador, 6 is Vietnam, 7 is Cuba, 8 is the Dominican Republic, 9 is Canada, and 10 is Korea. And I'll just kind of point that out. What I think is also important to note here, right, is that, so with Mexico, obviously they are our neighbor. But I also think it's important for us to note here in terms of these sending countries that there is also a lot of connections in terms of foreign policy here. If you look at particularly the Philippines, El Salvador, Vietnam, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic, as well as Korea, the U.S. has had either military installations in those countries, or we have intervened in war or been at war in those countries, whether it was a formal war or we were just in a military intervention there. It's important to note that there's a direct connection, and this is really what George Sanchez starts to get at in his writing. There's a direct connection between our foreign policy and who's coming to the United States. Right? It's also important to note that the development of economies, particularly in places like India, have been very, very sort of instrumental in also in creating connections between countries, because India is now one of the larger areas for manufacturing of goods that are then imported to the United States as part of the global marketplace. In terms of foreign education, we do know that there are large numbers of students from India who get their college education here in the United States in our education systems. The reason I decided to utilize this particular graphic is that it points to the contradictions that exist between the United States in terms of how we think about immigration policy alongside capitalism and labor. So on the one hand, here in the United States, we developed this huge border, right, which is symbolic of what we have there at the bottom. Do not enter, stop. We keep what we call militarizing our border. We try to build the wall higher, longer. We are even going so far as trying to extend the wall out into the ocean by 3 miles off the coast of San Diego. But at the same time that that's happening, you have the capitalist economy of the United States saying, help wanted, we have jobs, they're almost minimum wage, which in terms of what's happening in other countries, where with the passage of things like the North American Free Trade Agreement and other free trade agreements, we've pretty much decimated the economies of places like Mexico, as well as parts of Africa. And so when you decimate the internal economies of these countries, and and in Mexico, you think of things like the corn industry. Carolina Bank Munoz writes in her book studying the growth of the tortilla industry, that with the signing of the free trade agreement, what you begin to see is that that the independent farms in Mexico went under because under free trade, the U.S. exported its corn products, basically driving farmers in Mexico out of business. So in order to live, many of the farmers left the countryside, went into the cities of Mexico, couldn't find work there, and eventually migrated to the United States, doing all sorts of different jobs. And when we say help wanted, there are so many jobs here in the United States that people are unwilling to do, of which we've just studied one, agriculture. Agriculture has always been a demand industry and always needs workers, yet Americans are not willing to work in agriculture. The question becomes, why? Well, most of you can already think of the common sense answers to that question of why are U.S. citizens unwilling to work in the fields? Well, you could probably tick off the answers in one hand. Low wages, hard work conditions, there are numerous labor violations, and that it's hard labor, right, for no money. And so this is the U.S. capitalist system where on the one hand you have jobs that Americans are unwilling to work, but we're building borders to keep people out. So here's another important graphic. The question becomes, who hires immigrants, right? This is a table that looks at immigrants and natives by occupation in 2005. While the percentage might be slightly different, I didn't have a chance to pull the latest census population survey, but I do think these numbers have not changed very much over time. Here I want to highlight where we see immigrants working, and again, this should not be a surprise to you. You have, in terms of immigrants, farming, fishing, and forestry. We begin to see the immigrant share of the occupation is 43%. So of the people working in that, immigrants make up 43% of those who are there. In terms of construction and extraction is mining. You see in that industry immigrants are about 26% of that population. Building, cleaning, and maintenance, again, same thing. 34% are of people working in that industry are immigrants. Food preparation, almost 25%. Production, almost 22.5%. Transportation and moving, 17.2%. Personal care and service, 16.6%. My one guess is that in terms of change of numbers, the personal care and service may have actually grown. So here we begin to see that immigrants play a huge role in the U.S. economy. And I would actually just scroll maybe a little bit farther down that list where you have computer mathematical work where immigrants make up about 21%. And in terms of, and then life, physical, and social sciences, 17.8%. So life and physical sciences are things like biology and chemistry, biotech. So here we're beginning to see, while I highlighted those which would require kind of lower education thresholds, we also begin to see with those other two areas of computer and math, life and physical and social sciences, here we can begin to see that there are also huge education differences in immigrants, but immigrants are in all parts of the U.S. economy by simply looking at this list. Here we begin to see the foreign-born population and foreign-born as percentage of the total U.S. population, 1850 to 2009. The blue line represents the number of foreign-born, and then the light blue line is the foreign-born as a percentage of the total U.S. population. Basically, what you see is that between 1850 to about 1915, you have between 27% and 40% of the U.S. population were in fact foreign-born or immigrants. During the exclusion era, really from 1910 till about 1970, you began to see a huge decrease in the percentage that were foreign-born. And not surprisingly, you begin to see those numbers bounce back up post Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965, where again it's jumping to be that foreign-born is about 33% of the population. So in terms of contemporary U.S. migration, we began to see, where we begin to see the bounce, right, where I showed you that bounce in that previous graph, or if you go back on your notes, you'll see, you have the lifting of the immigration restrictions with the McCarran-Walter Act of 1952. Before 1952, there had been a set of quotas that essentially created an Asiatic barred zone where there was no migration from Asia. And there were you also had the beginning. You had the Bracero program that was working during that same time period. But essentially, it wasn't until after 1952 that you began to see an influx in immigrants, particularly from Asia and from Mexico. And more importantly, you had the passage of Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965, which I'll go over in a second, that played a huge role in diversifying the U.S. population. Globalization played a huge role in the change of jobs, and I'm going to spend a whole lecture on that later on in the semester. But globalization changed the technology and changed the way in which business was done in the United States and where immigrants were working. Globalization created two types of immigrant workers that we'll go into. One is the service sector, which I've talked about a little bit in previous lectures, which is the type of work where you're providing a service, everything from manicures and pedicures to dry cleaning to janitorial work to hotel workers. And then you also have professional immigrants, people who work in technology, biotech, the sciences, who are foreign-born and highly educated. So these are the types of immigrants we have in a more contemporary U.S. Migration setting. The reason why most immigration scholars point to the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965 as a significant moment in U.S. immigration policy is because this policy was actually developed to try to spur migration from Western Europe. This was happening during a time of a kind of an economic boom, and there was a desire to have more Western European immigrants. This policy, however, had the unintended consequences of actually really opening the doors for migration for Latinos and Asians. So what really created that change were the provisions that were opened up that allowed people to migrate to the United States, which I've listed. There's the 7 key ones that I've listed here. Number 1, unmarried children under 21 years of age of U.S. citizens. If you had become naturalized here in the United States, you could sponsor your children over here if they were under the age of 21. Spouses and unmarried children of permanent residents, meaning if you had a green card, you could sponsor people to the United States. Professionals, scientists, and artists of exceptional ability, that has always been a line item in almost all immigration policies. You can look back to one of the examples I would use from the World War II era, where they allowed someone to immigrate, was Albert Einstein. He was an exceptional scientist that was allowed to migrate to the United States. Married children over 21 years of age and their spouses and children of U.S. citizens. Siblings and their spouses and children of U.S. citizens. Workers in occupations with labor shortages. This is a very key line here. So in today's day and age, one of those categories are nurses. We see a huge influx of nurses, particularly from the Philippines, coming to work in the United States. The Philippines is a significant site for the migration of nurses because the United States set up the education system in the Philippines, so the education structure is rather similar. And so they're able to bring over and test in to get the proper credentials. But also, one of the areas that always has labor shortages is also agriculture. And so they've also always been able to recruit under the labor shortage provision. And then, of course, you have political refugees, those who have been displaced because of war, genocide, religious persecution. It's important to note, though, to get refugee status, it's a highly contentious process based usually on U.S. foreign policy. So on the one hand, one of the examples I would give is that Cubans and Vietnamese, where the U.S. had a military intervention, a formal military intervention, in order to stop communism, individuals escaping Vietnam and Cuba were granted asylum and were given refugee status, and with refugee status usually becomes relocation, relocation provisions and assistance from the U.S. government. El Salvador, on the other hand, although the United States was involved in a military occupation there, were often not given refugee status because the U.S. was not formally intervening in that country. And so politically it became volatile to actually give people refugee status if the U.S., if the U.S. was not formally recognizing that there were political malfeasances going on there and murders. It's murders and as well as other oppressive actions. I think it's also important to know, where are immigrants living? Well, post 1965, there was influx into what we call gateway cities. Gateway cities are cities that derive added economic muscle from strong links to the expanding global network of commerce and finance. Okay, that is a very loaded bullet point. Look around you. You live in Los Angeles. This is a gateway city. In other words, Los Angeles, part of what makes Los Angeles and places like New York successful in the global economy is that it transformed itself to be part of the global economy. It transitioned to have the economic infrastructure, the technological infrastructure that allows them to participate. And the technological infrastructure includes things like high-speed wireless, the ability to recruit a diverse workforce, the ability to have high-speed communication globally, stock exchange, education, etc. So these gateway cities serve as the key entry points for both pools of foreign workers and global imports. So global imports actually means the actual material goods. We also begin to see that around those cities, like a Los Angeles, like a New York, you also have an increased immigrant presence in suburban strongholds. Here we can look just outside of what we call LA County, and you could go look at Orange County. You can look at some of the smaller cities that are unincorporated, right? You can look at just even LA County out of Los Angeles City. If you look at some of the smaller cities, they can be largely immigrant. We can think of places like Whittier. We can look at Gardena, Westminster. These are all immigrant suburbs. So here is a geographic distribution of the foreign-born labor force in 1994, 2004, and 2009. Not surprisingly, well, actually, what I was going to say, what we do see is that most folks are located in California, but increasingly you're seeing it dispersed outside of California. In 1994, 33% of the foreign-born labor force was located in California. But here we're beginning to see that it's spreading out throughout the country, with here in 2009, 26% of the foreign-born labor force being in California, 39% in New York, Florida, Texas, New Jersey, and Illinois, and 35% in the rest of the country.